Welcome into the Odds and Audibles podcast. I'm Erik Skopil, and Mack is with me today on a pretty beautiful Thursday morning here in the Willamette Valley. I will say, weather's kind of turned. We had an ice storm a couple weeks ago, and now it's nice and sunny, 60 degrees probably today. Can't complain. But we've reached the point of the off season where most of the attention is now looking forward. Right? We kind of did our review segments. We've kind of broken down what 23 was, and to kind of help us steer the ship in the future, we've brought on 24/7 Sports National Recruiting and one-time Oregon Director of Recruiting, Cooper Petagna, to help us break it all down. Coop, how are we doing today?
We're doing great, man. Good to be back. I know last time I think we had a pretty good pod. I don't even know when that was. It felt like almost like half a year ago. So
summer.
Yeah.
I think it was preseason. Yeah.
Yeah. Been a while, but good year for the Ducks, man. They're recruiting well too. So I'm excited to talk a little Oregon recruiting.
For sure. And I wanted to start kind of broadly, and it's early, obviously. The rosters aren't finalized. That's the crazy thing. We were just talking before we got on here about how much changes every year. And Oregon's roster is not finalized by any means, I guess. But the skeleton of what this team could be is kind of there. And I'm curious, just like, what do you see Oregon being in broad terms in 2024? Like, what are some adjectives or things that you kind of see that you go, they're going to be kind of this type of team or that type of team? I'm just curious what your initial instincts are there.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think if you want to say retained Dan Lanning, I thought it was interesting when the Alabama job came up and Nick Saban retired. And I thought Dan Lanning was the ideal candidate. And still to this day, I believe that. And for him to be so bought into Oregon and what Oregon can be, and I truly believe this, and I believe this when Mario Cristobal was there, it just takes somebody that fully believes in the potential of that program. And I think Dan Lanning is that person. So I think Dan Lanning is going to be rewarded. I think that program is going to be rewarded. I think Phil Knight is going to be rewarded handsomely. And I went on Twitter and, I was pretty conservative with it. I said, I think there's going to be a big time return in terms of Oregon taking home some hardware in the next 2 to 3 years. I should have said that can really happen as soon as next year. I feel really good about what they're bringing in, obviously with Dylan Gabriel, 49 starts. They've just been very intentional, and I would say they got a lot of really good people in the program. I love what they've done on the offensive side of the ball, especially with Will Stein. But, if there was a model, like if somebody were to ask me and say, hey, how would you build it right now in terms of everything, NIL, transfer portal, Oregon would be the model for a lot of different reasons. Now, here's my thing. Not a lot of programs are going to have the financial backing of a guy like Phil Knight. I think the best thing to happen to Oregon's program is the alignment between Dan Lanning and Phil Knight. So I think this is a program that certainly understands the times. They've been flexible. They've been adaptable. And quite honestly, they've been aggressive. They're not out there star chasing. They understand where they need to improve. I love what they've done in terms of supplementing their roster via the transfer portal. And the other thing about this is anytime that you are going to build for a national championship and a sustainable product year in and year out, that's going to be your goal. You're going to need a little bit of luck as well, right? So if you're Dan Lanning and people are saying, all right, what job would he ever leave for? I think if you didn't leave for Alabama, I think it's pretty clear he's not going anywhere. But why would you leave, right? Because everything you want is at Oregon. And then you think about going to the Big Ten and the other three schools. You got Jed Fish at Washington, who's a very worthy adversary. I think you got to give him his respect, what he's done at Arizona. And then you look at USC, who they have failed to meet expectations, to be blunt, under Lincoln Riley going into year 3. And then you got UCLA, who under Chip Kelly is just a stagnant program. So if you're thinking about the West Coast and these big bodies and building it at the point of attack, it's the path of least resistance now for Dan Lanning and Oregon and how to build a roster. And he's done a tremendous job. I mean, we can go down the list with top-end talent really west of Texas that Oregon has done a tremendous job keeping home. And they've emphasized the line of scrimmage and the point of attack. They are the only team to do that. I would say going forward, I would say Kalen DeBoer, with all due respect, inherited a roster that was built from the POA and a Joe Moore award-winning, offensive line. This one, in terms of what it's going to materialize to be, I mean, like, it's been funny to kind of see the conversation between Washington and Oregon. It's like, well, yeah, they're 0-2. I get that. Give Kalen DeBoer, UW a lot of credit in the head-to-head 0-3. But in terms of what that's going to look like going forward, I always think year 3 for the head coach and the program where it's going to be now. Now is where these current head coaches are going to put their stamp on the program. And I just love pretty much everything that Dan Lanning has done and his staff, and from the day that they have stepped foot in Eugene to what they've done today. I talk about like calculated aggression. That's my favorite philosophical term when it comes to player personnel and building a roster. They've been calculated and they've been aggressive. Everything that they do has intentionality. So I am super pumped to see the product that they're going to put out on the field. And then also from a cultural standpoint, they kind of embody their head coach. It's kind of like that fire breather type of personality that we saw before the Colorado game. So I'm super excited, man. I think the sky's the limit. And now with the 12-team playoff, right, I think it's one of those things that the ball bounces your way. Maybe some matchups are a little bit more favorable. There's no reason in my mind to think that Oregon can't win a national championship next year. So I think from this point forward, they're going to be in it. And that's kind of the way that I see the program. So a long-winded answer just to say that I think they're a championship caliber team.
You talked a little bit about the portal and that aggression that they have and going just after needs and not going star chasing. Well, I'm going to ask you to go star chasing right here. Your favorite Oregon transfer portal edition. It can be the big name, it can be Gabe Moore, or it can be whoever you think is underrated in this group of 11 guys committed through the portal.
Yeah, I love Dante Moore. I think it's kind of a new way to bring in college football and say like, hey, this is what it is. I think Dante Moore's a recruitment, committed to Oregon, flips, goes to UCLA, an IL deal, 1 year, goes sour. He's back in the portal. Oregon and Dan Lanning has every reason to say, you know what, we're done. We've been through this, we're done. But Oregon's able to go out, they're able to secure their short-term future with a guy that's started almost 50 games in Dylan Gabriel as a plug and play. And then they're able to go out, get Dante Moore, convince him to come back, really take the redshirt year that he should have taken last year. And now you've set up your short-term and your long-term future as well. I think last year somebody asked me about this. Hey, what do you think about Oregon's class? And I'm like, I love Oregon's class, but you got to have the guy in the middle that's kind of the turnkey to make it all go. And now, to me, in my opinion, they have that for 2024 and they have that for 2025 and beyond. So I'm super excited about that. And I think that type of roster management, a lot of people will say, oh, well, it's NIL. Well, yeah, it's the world that we're living in. It's legal, right? Like what do you want them to do? They're doing the best with their resources. It is what it is. If you're not doing it, then I'm not sure what your goal is, right? So I think the way that they're able to navigate that quarterback position is a little bit of a trend-setting type of move where now I think it's going to have other programs thinking a lot bigger and a lot larger. And instead of saying, hey, you know what, let me just think about 2024, let's think about the future as well and kind of how that sets up. So I thought that was a fascinating move and I loved it.
I'm happy you touched on that because that was something I wanted to ask you about. And I also wrote fascinating down around it because I'm curious to see what the relationship and the mentorship looks like between having a Gabriel, because it's a unique situation where Moore comes in having started 5 games at UCLA, but seemingly with the expectation or understanding he won't be starting games at Oregon in 24 barring injury. And obviously we know that could change and Oregon has probably as good of a backup situation as anybody now. What does it require for someone like Dante Moore to go from his situation at UCLA to Oregon, and how unique is that? Like, you talk about that being something that other teams will try to replicate, and I know Ohio State kind of did it with grabbing 2 this cycle, but Sands, a younger prospect. I'm just curious, like, do you think it's really that replicatable? I said that very wrong. I think it's something that'll happen frequently because it's really interesting to me that Oregon was able to pull it off, and I think it did take kind of very specific circumstances for it to be pulled off like this.
I think it was a mulligan for Dante Moore, just to be honest. I think if he could have it back and redo it all over again, he'd probably say, you know what, I wouldn't start my career in LA. And I don't know all the details in terms of why Dante Moore ended up at UCLA and how that happened. Maybe it was a clearer path to the field. He didn't want to sit initially, and then, gets his first dose of college football. And reality kind of sets in a little bit and says, you know what, maybe I wasn't as ready to play as I thought I was. And in Dante Moore's defense, he went into a situation where I would say, from an interior offensive line standpoint, you turn on that Utah game, you can kind of see the issues with what a freshman quarterback would be facing, or any quarterback for that matter. It doesn't matter if it was Bo Nix. That's a tough environment to throw in an 18-year-old quarterback for the first time. So in terms of how repeatable it is in the future, I think, you talked about Ohio State as well with Julian saying, I think it's going to require a certain program and a certain head coach with a certain resume to say, you know what, this is still an attractive spot. Come sit for a year. We have your best long-term interest at play here. I don't think it's going to be something that every program can just do, right? I think it's going to be certain programs like Oregon. We've seen it with Ohio State as well. Alabama as well. You look at Austin Mack coming over from UW, right? Even though he hasn't played. And obviously that's a coach to player situation. These guys at the end of the day, ultimately, I think are starting to realize and understand a little bit more. Like you've seen like Dante Moore and Will Stein, Julian Sain and Bill O'Brien, right? Austin Mack and Ryan Grubb and Kalen DeBoer, right? It's going to be more like that quarterback-coach relationship is really important, especially when you're talking about highly touted guys that believe that they have a future on Sundays as well.
Oregon's 2024 recruiting class, 26 kids, 21 4-stars. There were some, question marks going into early signing day, mostly around like wide receiver. Then they get Jeremiah McClellan, flip him from Ohio State, then flip Ryan Pelham from USC. In your perspective from a national guy, we don't get too many national guys on here, but was it more impressive to the finish to the class that they were able to flip McClellan, they were able to flip Pelham, or was it just the fact that they were able to retain all these guys even down to the finish? I think they had everybody sign on early signing day, including guys like Jaquan McRoy, who had Colorado going after him, and plenty of others.
Well, it's interesting. He comes from Kirby Smart tree and Dan Lanning. I mean, obviously everybody knows this, but if you hear Kirby Smart talk a lot, he always talks about being able to keep the mentality of being a hunter instead of being the program that is hunted. That's the difference, right? Now that applies not only on the field of play, that applies in the sphere of recruiting as well. And I think that's the mentality of Dan Lanning. He's always on the hunt, which is, why we've seen them be able to kind of pull some things off late in the cycle. You look at Jeremiah McClellan. I mean, it's kind of like death by 1,000 paper cuts. They just kind of keep coming. They have guys on their board that commit to other programs. It's not going to deter them, right? In most cases, a program like Oregon or a program like Georgia is just going to turn it up a little bit more, right? And ultimately, at the end of the day, the program that is the most consistent and relentless with their messaging and then is able to pair that up with on-field results, ultimately, at the end of the day, is going to be able to win. So it's like you just never know. Like you look at Gatlin Bear's recruitment, and we'll see what happens with him. It's down to Michigan and Oregon. Yep. Michigan seems to be in the driver's seat. And all of a sudden, Jim Harbaugh is off to the NFL. What if Dan Lanning was to take his foot off the gas pedal? What would happen with that recruitment? It leaves a window for Sharon Moore to get back into the driver's seat, where if Oregon was to do what they've been doing the entire time, now Oregon's in a situation where they find themselves where more than likely Gatlin Bear is probably going to end up in Eugene, right? So that's what it is. It's just consistent. You never know what's going to happen. Nick Saban could retire. Kalen DeBoer could go down to Alabama, so on and so forth. And then all of a sudden, you're presented with this opportunity to cash in, right? So it's all about consistently putting yourself in the best position available to take advantage of opportunities when you have that window. And I think Dan Lanning and his staff are very keen to that. And I also think they put the same amount of effort in playing defense and retaining their relationships as they do trying to flip a prospective player as well. So no, I'm not surprised, man. I think there's only, I could probably count on one hand how many programs kind of operate that way. And I think, Dan and his staff are one of them.
one of the things that really stands out, and you've already addressed a little bit, but is how Oregon has recruited the trenches, and in particular on the West Coast. Like if we look at the 24/7 Sports rankings, which I know you're involved with a little bit, Oregon landed 3 of the top 4 defensive line / edge rushers in 24, 3 of the top 5 linebackers. Just talking West Coast footprint here. What does that do long term for a program? Because last year Oregon, I don't have the exact stats up in front of me, but it was similar where they went and basically landed undoubtedly the best defensive line talent, best linebacker talent in the conference. What does that do long term for a program, especially in a part of the country, as you established, that is kind of maybe lacking in this area, and so to clean up and get 75% or 60% of the top guys, what does that do for Oregon, do you think, going forward?
Well, short term, obviously, it gives you you get a chance to get the best talent in your program and develop those guys. That's what's important. Long term, to me, is the importance. You are sending a message to every prospect and their family and the decision makers on the West Coast that the best players at these positions have an opportunity to play premier football at a championship level, and they don't have to go east. That's it. That's essentially what you're saying. You want a chance to come to this program, compete for a national championship, and then have a career on Sundays. You don't have to go to Georgia. You don't have to go to Alabama. You don't have to play in the SEC. You can have it all right here. That's the message. And here's the other thing. When the other 3 programs from the West Coast aren't doing that, it makes it so much easier. Like, this is what I keep coming back to. It's a lot about Oregon, but it is a lot about USC. USC, hypothetically, is supposed to be the premier program on the West Coast. They have dropped the ball on that. That is not their identity. That is not what they do. They want to recruit more nationally. They can do that. I understand that. But now what they're doing is they're leaving another window of opportunity open for Oregon and Dan Lanning that says, all right, you don't want to recruit both sides of the line of scrimmage from the West Coast, and you feel like you got to go to Florida to go get those guys. Great for us. You don't want Aiden Breland? I'll take him. You don't want Elijah Rushing? I'll take him. Great. Who are some other guys that they brought in, at the second level, first and second level as well. So, if you got a grocery store closer to your house that is able to kind of provide everything else that you need, why are you going to travel the extra 20 minutes, to go further down the line and go get your premium beef, right? So he's shopping the right way in my mind. And there's not a lot of people holding his hand to the fire and saying, hey, you got to come through us to come get what you want. That is just not the case. He's got pretty much free reign on the West Coast right now, which kind of blows my mind. But I think that's kind of the way that, he thinks about it. I think he's smart and understands that. And I think that's big part of the reason he decided to stick around at Oregon is, why am I going to go to a more competitive market where more people think the way that I do, rather than just stay out here, I get everything I want, and nobody's really going to push me in a way that, I'd be pushed down there.
I was going to ask something about, do you think that, recruiting at this level, having the best class in program's history, if this was, if they could repeat it consistently, but I think you just answered that. So I'm going to audible here and ask a different question. Again, another like national perspective that I want to hear from you. When you kind of touched on it earlier with Alabama's job opening up and Dan Lanning being like whatever he was labeled as when it first happened. I just wanted to hear about that kind of sweepstakes from your perspective as a national guy, and then what it kind of meant to the overall landscape of college football when Dan was like, no, I'm coming back, when he released the video.
Yeah, it's a parity shift, right? And quite honestly, like, I think so highly of Dan Lanning because I respect so much of the principles and the values and the way that they recruit and their aggression. It's just, it's kind of the way that I was brought up within the industry, and then to see them recruit with so much force, but intentionality. You don't get to see that very often, right? You see that out of programs like Alabama and Georgia. We haven't seen it on the West Coast in quite some time. So in terms of the Alabama job, I thought he would have been the perfect guy for it. Everything I just said, it kind of gets you more excited that he's sticking at Oregon, right? Because I think there's more of like the margin of error at a place like Alabama is so slim, right? Versus what he has done in Oregon in a short amount of time to build it up to what it can be, and
Right.
also have another step in front of them as well. So, I think it's interesting, man. Kalen DeBoer, which I don't have to tell Oregon fans, is a hell of a coach. I think he is one of the best coaches in all of college football, especially when it comes to Saturdays. Now, that being said, the biggest question that I had about Kalen DeBoer when he was at Washington was, okay, what happens when we get to year 3? UW is more than likely going to have 10-plus players drafted this upcoming year in 2024, right? And the majority of those guys I'm very familiar with, because the majority of those guys came from the 19 and 20 class, right? If you go through that roster, they did an exceptional job adding some seasoning to it. Guys like Jabbar Muhammad, Michael Penix, Jalen Polk, and Dylan Johnson. Like, those guys took that program to another level in the last 2 years. So they deserve all that credit. But in terms of the homegrown talent and what they were able to do in the Chris Peterson era, I did not see them doing that presently at the time. It wasn't like they were backfilling that talented of a roster with that type of talent. I didn't see the Rome Odunzes. I didn't see the Jalen McMillans. I didn't see the Troy Fautanos. I didn't see the Eddie Ulifacios and so on and so forth. And it's not to say that those guys can materialize, but all right, when all else is even and UW is losing the majority of their starters coming back from a national championship year, what's it going to look like? Because I got one program doing this and the other program, I just don't know. It's a very much wait and see, right? So this is what I expected from a talent acquisition standpoint, is like, they just keep coming. That's Oregon. They just keep coming. They're just getting better and better and better. Washington is like, okay, they're here. This is maybe as high as I can see them at this point, and I don't think that they have recruited at the level where they're going to overcome the level that they're playing at right now. So Kalen DeBoer is now at a situation in Tuscaloosa where, yes, he inherits one of the most talented rosters in all of college football. But it's not like that program at UW was this well-oiled machine when it came from a recruiting standpoint, where they're like, yeah, these guys are world beaters in terms of everything I've said about describing Oregon in terms of talent acquisition and strategy, and just kind of like foaming at the mouth when it comes to recruiting.
Yeah.
That, like, if I'm being honest, that is not Kalen DeBoer. Kalen DeBoer is one of the best coaches in the country. I've said that. When it comes to recruiting, talent acquisition, roster, all that's really important. Now, here's the thing. I don't know if the two most talented rosters played in the national championship this year, but I do think the two most complete teams did, and then being able to say, all right, well, you think of everything about scheme, the quarterback position as well, and then the experience. I think that's really kind of what overcame at the end of the day. But when you don't have that, what's going to get you there, right? So I think it's going to be super fascinating to see how he navigates, especially the first 2 years. And here's my thing. They got the talent. If he can go out and win 20 games in his first 2 years, win some big ones, I think Kalen DeBoer is in a really good situation, because now the way college football is with recruiting, it's really not recruiting. It's just transactional, right? So we live in this transactional space. So if he can prove that he can get the job done there, and his first 2 years are going to be super pivotal, then I think that kind of opens the door. It buys him some time. Some people say, all right, this guy's legit. And now you can continue to add talented bodies in there. But there is, as transactional as it is, it's still not that black and white. Like, relationships matter to some point, right? So we'll see, man. It's a odd concoction in terms of, taking a guy out of South Dakota, and he's a hell of a coach. He's a hell of a dude. That place is different, man. And the first time they drop a game that they weren't supposed to drop, we're going to be able to kind of feel what that's going to be like. So, he's got his hands full. It's going to be fascinating to kind of see how that shakes out.
I think it was Tom Fernelli on the cover 3 the other day who said it's going to be like stepdad syndrome for the Alabama fan base. So, like, who's this new guy leading the show? Like, it's just going to be a weird thing, right? When anytime they lose, they're like, Dad wouldn't let that happen. All right, we're going to take a quick break here. We'll have more with Cooper Petagna after the break. We're going to start looking at Oregon's moving to a new conference. I think Cooper might have some thoughts that we want to look at from that perspective. So we'll take a quick break here and be back on the Odds and Audibles. All right, welcome back to the Outs and Audibles podcast. Cooper, new conference for the Ducks. Broadly, just broad thoughts. What do you think? Oregon going to the Big Ten?
I'm excited about it, man. Because I think to myself every time I like give a compliment to Dan Lanning or Oregon on Twitter. Somebody calls me like a homer, and I was like, man, I was there 1 year. I never worked with this guy. I've never met this dude. I just respect him at a very high level in the way that they go about their business. But I'm excited because I think everything that they had been building towards is a culmination of what you're going to see this year. And I'm excited about their brand of football that they're building and the physicality that they want to play with at the line of scrimmage, colliding with a conference that is known for that, right? So I think they're going to be a great fit. I think they're an ideal fit for the Big Ten and what they want to do. And the other thing about Oregon is like, yeah, people are going to talk about their physicality and what they've done at the line of scrimmage. I'm excited what they've done at the skill positions too, right? They got a little bit of everything. So they can bang inside, but they're also got a lot of speed, a lot of athleticism on the perimeter as well, both sides of the football. So I think it's going to be an interesting blend. And I think this is going to be a team from day one that is really not going to have a lot of issues acclimating. I think that the travel is going to be fascinating, right? I also think the environments as well. Like being in the Pac-12, there's some games you like go play at Cal and there's nobody in the stadium, or Stanford. Now it's like Big Ten. It's like, all right, man, like you're on the road at Iowa or Wisconsin or Nebraska. Like doesn't matter their record. Like these people show up, right? Like these are competitive environments, or it's a little different breed of football. And I'll give Oregon fans a lot of credit. Like it was one place that we played at, whether I was an opponent at Washington or when I worked there. What was the COVID year? But so I guess when I was at UW, where you step in that stadium, like it's got a little different feel than every other stadium in the Pac, right? So it's going to be fun. I'm super interested just to kind of see how they are able to, I don't want to say adjust, but acclimate into that environment. And I got a pretty good feel that they're going to be up to the task. So I think there's going to be a big chip on their shoulder too, man. Like I think he's going to have these boys ready to play. And I'm excited about it.
Why do you think there's going to be a chip on the shoulder? I feel like go ahead.
Yeah, good coaches always find a chip, right?
Mm-hmm.
You look at that Colorado game, and it's like, you're watching it before, and obviously, like, you can be a prisoner of the moment. But it was like, man, it's like, all right, you're watching that pregame speech, and you're like, all right, these guys have taken that personal. Should you take it personal? I don't know. But, he's got his boys fired up, and those guys are out there and they go out and they get the result that they want, right? You look at Georgia, and every time they host a national championship trophy, one of the players said, hey, oh, you guys doubted us. Or like, dude, we had you guys in the championship before, like, what the hell are you talking about? These guys, there's a little bit of psychology magic to it. We're like, dude, these guys are kind of brainwashed a little bit. So any type of edge, any type of motivation that you can find, I'm sure Dan Lanning's going to say, hey, man, they just think we're another West Coast team. We got to show them like what we're really about, right? So, I think that's what it comes down to. And like I think the great competitors, I mean, you look from Michael Jordan to Nick Saban, they're always looking for that little bit of edge that they can, every game, every matchup is going to be a little bit different.
Do you have, obviously it's still so damn early, but and you kind of touched on it, but do you have like some sort of expectation for what Oregon's going to do in their first year? Like they've been ranked pretty high, but is there an expectation from you?
Yeah, I mean, I quite honestly, I'd be, I like I said in the beginning, I got to stick to it, right? This is a team that I fully expect to have all the goods to compete for the national championship at the end of the year. So, I expect this to be a double-digit win team in the Big Ten, and I think those should be the expectations. I always talk about the third year being a critical year. You think about what Dan Lanning's done, won 20-plus games at Oregon. I think they have all the pieces. I think they have continuity on both sides of the football. This is year 3. They have an identity established, and they have a vision for going forward, right? So I think when you think about that, I like the fact that, year 3 for a head coach too, it's like, you learn a lot, right? You learn a lot in year 1, you apply it in year 2, you learn some other things. Now year 3, you're like, all right, things are slowing down a little bit. I know what to expect. I know what we're getting into. I know the adjustments that we need to make. So in terms of the tip of the spear of the operation, I expect it to be the sharpest this year. So I got a lot of expectations for this team, and they're going to be right up there with Ohio State, right up there with Michigan, right up there with those guys, and there's no reason to think why they can't be. Right? I would ask, like, on the opposite side, why wouldn't they be able to do that? Right? So they're certainly talented enough.
You've got such an interesting career resume in terms of everywhere you've worked. Having worked in Michigan's recruiting department, you were at Cincinnati, I think, shortly after. Then you went west to Washington and then down to Oregon. I'm just curious, having had experience with the Big Ten, being in the Midwest, even at Cincinnati, that's a little different, and then being in the Pac-12, like what, and you kind of touched on it with some of the environment stuff, but what is really different between Big Ten football and Pac-12 football? Maybe that, obviously the Oregon staff has a sense of, but our listeners maybe who are entering a year where it's very strange, where you're switching conferences, just give a sense of kind of what you noticed kind of being in two different parts of the country and in two different conferences like that.
The line of scrimmage and the continuity at the line of scrimmage, especially on the offensive line. The biggest thing is when you're recruiting in the Midwest is, different parts of the country that I've learned this, and it's certainly obvious, but they're going to be richer at certain positions, right? There's going to be, if you're down south, I mean, obviously the point of attack, the mid-skill positions, you can find a little bit of everything. But if you're in the Midwest, in terms of developmental bodies at the offensive line, I mean, these are some big creatures here, right? That in terms of once they get in the strength conditioning program, nutritional program. I just remember when I was in Michigan lining up against Wisconsin and lining up against some of these teams, Michigan State, in terms of the consistency with the line of scrimmage play, in terms of the size and what you're looking for, and the physicality that was kind of brought week in and week out. Very much so, the majority of the teams in the Big Ten, the identity is up front. That's where the game is played. In the Pac-12, it did not feel that way. It felt like when I was at Oregon, we were trying to build that mentality, certainly under Mario Cristobal, where, hey, we were going to be a physical team that was going to own the line of scrimmage. That was not the way the majority of programs thought out west. But if you were able to go out and find those caliber of players, that type of size, we always felt like that was going to be a huge advantage. And we did a good job of that in my short time at Washington as well. I mean, you think about guys like Kalepo, Bulow, Fatanu, Rosengarten, right? Like, all those guys consistently across the board had the size, had the intangibles that we were looking for, right? Which has proved to be, even in a dynamic passing offense like Kalen DeBoer, a big plus for a team like Washington last year. So that's really it, man. Like, and it's a different style of play. Like, those pads are popping, those, same deal with the helmets as well. It's like, there's a different level of, I would say, intensity in the trenches that I'm excited, because quite honestly for Oregon, like, that's going to be a challenge for them. But ultimately at the end of the day, I think that's going to be a part of their trajectory, is the necessity of being able to play sustainable, high-level football at the point of attack. And nothing is going to bring that out more than playing a team like Michigan or playing a team like Ohio State, where you're going to have to go see those big bodies week in and week out.
I've got a very broad question for you next. And, I feel bad asking 33 minutes into the show because it could be a long answer, but last time you were on, we had a great conversation about NIL, and Boston College's head coach, or now former head coach, Jeff Hafley, just went to Green Bay to be their defensive coordinator, and Pete Thamel of ESPN reported, like, basically he just wants to coach ball. Like, he doesn't want to deal with the NIL, he doesn't want to deal with the portal and things like that. And there are some reports when Saban retired that might have been something about retiring, like all the NIL stuff. Do you anticipate this continuing in college football, where coaches are just like, this is a bit too much? It's the transactional idea that you talked about earlier in recruiting and in the portal. Like, do you think that this is something that is going to continue?
100%, man. I mean, think about all these variables that you have to go through and hoops you got to jump through, and you don't know how much guys are getting paid, and they're requesting this much money, and there's no structure. and it's very difficult. And the calendar on top of it makes no sense, drives these guys into the ground. It's just always something. So you would like to think as a head coach or just a coach of a position room, like, hey, I have some sort of expectation of knowing what my room is going to look like or my roster is going to look like. And at any point, with the first and second transfer portal window, it's just kind of like, whoa. And even if these guys have no intention, but they want to test the market, they're able to do that as well. I mean, they're able to kind of hold you hostage. So, there are a couple recruitments that I didn't really Lance Hurd played almost 200 snaps this past year, the former 5-star out of Louisiana, got some really good spot duty. I wouldn't call him a developmental guy, but he's got some room to certainly improve technically. Ends up jumping in the portal, goes to Tennessee, probably ends up making good money, but it's like continuity at those positions long term is everything. Those are developmental positions, right? Like the Dante Moore stuff makes me feel like icky. Like I'd feel so much better about Dante Moore if he had went to Oregon, had to sit behind Bo Nix. Maybe they didn't think he was ready. They brought in Dylan Gabriel anyway. Now he's got to sit 2 years, right? As opposed to he goes to UCLA. Now he's back at Oregon. Now he's got to sit another year. It's kind of like, man, a quarterback's confidence is a really delicate thing. So Hafley wasn't a guy that loved to recruit. I will say that. But, at the end of the day, a lot of these ball coaches, they want to coach ball. They don't want to deal with all this other stuff, right? Why would you? And there's no level of, hey, this is what it's going to look like. I could wake up tomorrow and I got to play roster defense. Nobody escapes from this. Nick Saban doesn't escape from it, more than 3 quarters into the season. And he's got, a third of his roster saying, hey, this is what it's going to take to keep me next year. I got 6 rings. I got 49 first-round draft picks. And I got a guy who hadn't played any snaps telling me that he needs $100,000 to stay. Yeah. Hell yeah, I go grab my boogie board and get the hell out of there. It's not worth it, So I don't know, it's crazy, man. A lot of the money that's being thrown around, people, I think a lot of people on the outside think it's crazy and they hear all these numbers. And then you talk to like personnel directors and you talk to some of these coaches and it's like, it's the worst. They hate it. They're pulling out their hair. They don't sleep. Like their job is just completely unpredictable. They have no idea what tomorrow brings. Always the response is, well, they get paid a lot of money. They should be able to deal with whatever. Yeah, I get it. But on the other side, it almost makes it incredibly impossible to do your job. So yes, I think the answer is that, you will see a lot of coaches, whether it's coaches opting to leave for the NFL or whether it's coaches just saying, you know what, this is kind of taking 5 to 6 years off my shelf life. I'm done, man. Like I'm not doing this. And now what you're seeing more inexperienced coaches getting head coaching opportunities at an earlier age. Because it's kind of, I don't want to say trimming the fat, but it's pushing a lot of these guys that really don't have the bandwidth to be like, hey, I'm going to do this anymore. For a lot of these guys, man, it's an ego thing. It always is. Like, I've done this at a high level for all this time. Now I got somebody's, 7-on-7 coach from high school telling me, we got to pay this kid $60K. It's like, what in the hell are we doing? And that's the question that I think a lot of these people inside organizations are asking every day, because there's no rules. It's the wild, wild west on steroids.
And you get, based upon what you just said, Cooper, why someone like Hafley would say, let's go take competitive salary to move up to the NFL where I'm not having to jump through any of these hoops. Like it makes sense why that's becoming something people look to do.
Why does the NFL have a better quality of life than college football? The NFL, multi-billion-dollar industry. I talked to a scout the other day that there's a GM job open in college football, a Power 5 job. I asked him, I said, would you be interested in this? This job probably pays 4 or 5x of what he's making right now. He said, absolutely not. I talk to these NFL liaisons every day when I go into these schools. They are miserable. They're always looking for a way out. They want to go to the NFL. They hate their job. They're not even doing the things that really first interested them when they got into the profession. Now it's just, you're a product of what the game has become, and the game has become dictated by a lot of people that don't have an expertise in this really at the end of the day, but they got the upper hand right now because of the way that it's, continue to spiral out of control, quite honestly.
I'm not sure there's a natural transition to this question to wrap it up here, but I wanted to ask you about this because we hear so frequently people reference Dan or Mario or different coaches that have been at Oregon as bringing like an SEC approach to recruiting to the West Coast. And that's been referenced a lot with Lanning based upon his stops at Bama and at Georgia. I want to get your perspective as somebody who's worked on recruiting staffs at Alabama and at LSU. And so you've been in that part of the country, you've been around those types of programs. What does that mean? When you hear SEC recruiting approach, does that mean one or two things, or is that just a broad term that people like us that are being lazy don't necessarily understand it or are using?
No, it means putting the player and putting the talent before anything else. It's like, here's my thing. I remember this. I think I might have told you guys last time we were on. Like when I was under Chris Peterson at Washington, man, you talk about like complete human being, CEO, you talk about structure, organization. Everybody knew their job, knew their responsibility, knew what you were doing throughout the entire day. And we would do all those things. And then I got to Oregon, and it was, under Mario, it was kind of like, hey, man, a lot of shooting from the hip. It was kind of willy-nilly. It wasn't always organized. But the difference is, at the end of the day, Mario was all about the player. And what I mean by that is he understood that the bottom line and how you move the needle at the end of the day is whether you got a guy like Justin Herbert, whether you got a guy like Penei Sewell, whether you got a guy like Javon Holland. So when you're in the fourth quarter of that game and you're wondering, all right, what's the difference here? It's one or two plays from one of those three guys that I just mentioned, right? It's a game-winning INT to seal it. It's a play of Justin Herbert rolling out, making a ridiculous throw against his body to Dylan Johnson, right? Like it's Penei Sewell not allowing any pressures. And at UW, it was so much about, hey, like, and I cherish this about Coach Pete, and this is the way it is at a lot of places. And I think it was part of why we've had so much success with a lot of these guys getting drafted. We wanted to make sure that we had the person right. But at the end of the day, man, like, you can spend so much time on a whiteboard, or you can spend so much time talking about culture. But at the end of the day, like, you got to have the Jimmies and Joes, right, to put you in that position. And if you can coach ball, then your responsibility becomes, all right, can you get those guys motivated? Can you get them locked in? And then can you put them in the best position to be successful? So when you talk about an SEC mentality, Kirby Smart knows that his best asset is his roster. And it's the same with Mario Cristobal. And you could be an average coach. You can be an above average coach. But when you have that caliber of talent to overcompensate and to cover for a lot of those deficiencies, that's what that means. And when you don't have that talent, your margin of error shrinks by a considerable amount. Then you have to be perfect. Then it puts more pressure on the play callers. Then you have to be right more times than you are wrong. But if you got the guys that can roll, that are locked in and are coachable and can be developed, shoot, man, yeah, it makes everybody look like a genius, right? It's like Glenn Schumann, like Glenn Schumann's a hell of a ball coach. Nobody's recruiting the second level better than them. And it's like, I believe in that guy. I believe in what he can be. And a lot of that, same with Todd Hartley at Georgia in that tight end room. But guess what, man? Like, you got Brock Bowers, you got Oscar Delp, you got Lawson Lucky, you got Raylan Wilson, CJ Allen, you got Justin Williams. Like, it's the best clay of any position room in the country, both in the tight end and the linebacker. You know what I'm saying? It's going and if you're a good coach, right, those guys are going to make you look a lot better than you actually are. That's the benefit of recruiting that caliber of talent. So I think as a head coach, and this is kind of what I see with Clemson a little bit, the moment that you believe your secret sauce is your program and your message and your player development, and we'll get them here and we'll get them right, Yes, that's important. It's all part of it. But really, at the end of the day, these guys got to have the physical ability, physical clay that you can mold and make sure to materialize at the end of the day that these guys are going to be Sunday players. And that's what it comes down to, when you're running that race at the end of the season, who's got more ponies, right? Now, I did say that I thought the two most complete teams were in the national championship. I didn't think the most talented teams were. Thought Alabama and I thought Georgia were the two most talented teams. But who's playing the best football? And that's kind of where coaching comes in, is in January, right? Experience as well. So there are some other catalysts to that. Not the most talented team is not always going to win, but think about Alabama, man. Would they beat USF by 10 points earlier in the season, 2 touchdowns, whatever it is? That's a team that continued to get better, got coached throughout the season, found their identity. All of a sudden, they're one game away from another national championship, right? So I'd rather have that team at the end of the day that has a ceiling to continue to grow into than a team that's got a small margin of error that almost has to play perfect week in and week out. And that's what I've seen with Oregon, to be quite honest. Is this is a guy, he is continuing to raise the ceiling of the program by continuing to stockpile talent. And ultimately, at the end of the day, he's making his job easier. He's making Tosh Lupoi's job easier. He's making Will Stein, Wilson Love's, all their jobs easier. When you have some of the best players and athletes in the country, it makes everybody's job easier.
Fantastic stuff, Cooper. Thank you for 45 minutes. I mean, that was more than any of us anticipated. Tell the listeners where they can find your work. And I know you're ramping up here for, it's less than a week away, the original signing day, but now the late signing period. Tell listeners kind of what they can expect from you in a short term.
I'm not shocked by the 46-minute mark, because we do a podcast every Tuesday and Wednesday, and I think every time we go in there, we're like, hey, we're going to do 30 minutes, and it ends up being like 58, 59 minutes on the dot. So every Tuesday and Wednesday, we do the 24/7 Sports Football Recruiting Pod. That's at 5 o'clock Eastern Time. That will be on the 24/7 Sports YouTube channel, or you can find that wherever you find your podcasts as well. And then we have from 2 to 5 next Wednesday, 24/7 Sports YouTube channel will be hosting National Signing Day. So team recaps, positional breakdowns, anything you need, all right there, man. Going to be a lot of fun.
He's the best. Thank you, Cooper. And thank you for those listening to listen to the Otts and Audibles podcast. Erik Skopil and Jared Mack signing off. We'll have Matt back with us next week, probably Monday or Tuesday. Don't have that fully figured out, but I guess we'll talk to you guys sometime next week. Talk to you later, folks.
Thanks, guys.